Good evening. Welcome to DiversiTV. I'm your host and producer, Mark Harris. This is our season 4. So if you're new to DiversiTV, welcome. If you're a returning and part of our growing audience, welcome back. To go into DiversiTV's mission, we illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. To that end, our season, roughly corresponding to LCC terms, goes like this. We're in our 4th season. We usually always start with Native since we're on Turtle Island. So April 16th we did that. Then Anglo Perspective, then Africans in America, Latino. Last week we did hip-hop culture. This week, we're covering the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, two-spirit rubric. Disability next week, youth, and ending up with class. Our guest tonight is Alejandro Jaurez. Welcome. And Ali does a number of things, so let's start off with where are you from and where did you grow up?
Okay. Well, my name is Alejandro, and I grew up in Southern California, in Los Angeles, and that's where I was born and raised in East LA, little town called Bell. Basically, it was a very diverse area, mostly because there's so many people there. You know, like LA has 7 million people, right, and the state of Oregon has 3.5 million people. So it was just a lot, you know. And
Bell is larger than Portland, if memory serves. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. so it's one of those micro cities within the LA County area, but it's huge, and it's about like 90% Latino there. And then I did my undergrad at University of California at Santa Barbara.
What's your degree?
Chicano Studies and Art Studio.
Okay, all right.
And that's kind of what I did in terms of like where I grew up and where I'm from.
Okay, so how did you come to Eugene and also LCC or Lane County?
After I graduated, I met my partner in a conference, and you know, he was from Eugene, Oregon, or he is from Eugene, Oregon, but he was a student, and I had just graduated, and we did a long distance relationship for a little under a year, and it got pretty serious. And since I had just stopped going to school, I didn't have as much going on as he did, so I decided just to move up here and give it a try up here, especially since LA is huge and it's also pretty unlivable in regards to housing, the cost of everything, right, transportation, and I figured I just got out of school, I had all of these loans, so I was like, well, I'll just move to somewhere smaller and see, like a slower pace and see how that works. And that actually ended up working. Slower
pace,
yeah. Yeah. And so I moved up here, and I've been here for 3 years, and then, that's how I got here.
So explain you're an organizer for OSA, the Oregon Student Association, and you're associated with OSAC, the Oregon Students of Color Coalition. So what do your duties entail?
Okay. The Oregon Student Association is a statewide coalition of student governments. Okay. So basically all of the major universities, public universities of the state of Oregon are members of OSA through student fees. Okay. And there are 3 campus organizers that are based in PSU and Portland State, the U of O, and at Lane Community College. And our job is basically to run political campaigns and to advise students. So my job is similar to an advisor, but I do specific political advising.
Political campaigns from the student's point of view.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not employed by the college. Yeah. My money comes from the student fees, and they go toward the Oregon Student Association, so there's no conflict of interest in that sense. So if I represent students, I don't answer to the administration here. So it's pretty important, especially if I'm helping them advocate for themselves, that I don't have an interest in any of the administration's things. So, yeah. And part of my duties is we have OSA is also an affiliate, has 2 affiliate organizations, the Oregon Student of Color Coalition, which basically is a coalition of BSUs, which is like Black student unions, Latino student unions, the Native American student associations, all of those specific culture or student organizations kind of get together.
And white students too, it should be.
Yeah, they do, but it's mostly to represent those students. And basically we do the same kind of deal where we work on the statewide level to pass laws or to do voter registration, those kinds of things. And then I also work with the Oregon Student Equal Rights Alliance, which is same deal except for the LGBT community.
Okay. So I guess that logically segues into what would be the next question. So how do you self-identify in terms of the whole context of what some people refer to as identity politics, as if, oh, we're all the same, we should be all the same, I guess, when they use that general rubric or something like that. But, you know,
yeah.
you know, well, who are you? And, you know, yeah, your politics are limited to, you know, your whatever identity box you check. You know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I identify a little differently than most people, mostly because of my major, because I studied Chicano studies at UCSB, which is basically the history of Mexican Americans, the political history of Mexican Americans in the U.S.
Yeah.
So I identify as Chicano, which is that term, which is the term to kind of refer to politicized Mexican American identity.
Yeah.
And then I also identify as queer, mostly because I don't think that the term gay or some other the terms represent me adequately. I feel that it asks more questions, and that's usually what I want. Both of those, like when people are like, "How do you identify? What are you?"
Yeah.
I usually say, queer Chicano, which doesn't necessarily wrap it up nicely in people's heads, which is intentional so that people can ask me more about what they mean.
Do they usually?
Yeah. They're awkwardly sometimes, but most of the time. Most of the time, people will say, "Well, what does that mean?" Or "What do you mean by that?" Or "What are you into?" And I think that that's a better conversation about my identity or people's identity than wrapping it up very easily. I often encounter a lot of white people will just say, "Well, I'm just white," but I feel that there's a lot of diversity in whiteness also, and it kind of people end up limiting themselves in terms of who they are, and then that's the problem with identity politics in general.
Right.
Is that you have a hard time identifying other aspects of your personality outside of it. So it's really easy to box yourself in and say, well, I'm a gay Chicano and I do only the things that a gay Chicano does, or a queer Chicano, and when you open it up that way, people end up asking you more about you, and that's, I feel, how conversations like that should go.
I mean, a lot of times when the interrogation of how those terms come to be, like, why queer, and without examining, for example, part of the worldview where that word came from in English was basically pre-Christian, the so-called pagan origins in which, along with the term fairy, etc., there were mythical, non-human beings, magical, basically, of fluid sexuality, et cetera, and so there was basically seen as a form of power, right? So, not just simply as the English word, which suggests strange,
Right.
Like, so, does anybody interrogate that term, from the point of view of what would be the Aztec word or the Chicano word, or
Yeah, they do, and then there's a whole study around it also. But there's an aspect of, well, not an aspect. I don't like to identify as Aztec mostly or anything like that. I think a lot of people who are Mexican American or Mexican automatically identify as Aztec, but
yeah.
there's there's a diverse like Native Americans in Mexico are as diverse as they are in the United States, right? So not everybody's Cherokee in the U.S.
Right.
But because they're the most famous or the biggest empire was created in the city of Mexico, then most people would say, well, I'm Aztec because I'm Mexican, and that's not necessarily true. For like my family's from Nayarit, and they figuring out what tribe people were from, because my grandmother's indigenous.
Yeah.
They were Huichol.
Okay.
And they weren't Aztec, so
right.
it's hard to to figure out what that is. But it's safe to say that, Chicano studies or this, or like when people study Mexican Americans or Mexico, they just focus on Aztec, right? So there was a tradition of, I don't want to say a tradition. I think what's interesting about modern times or kind of how our current economic system is organized is that you have to fit into certain gender norms, right? Mostly because of how labor is distributed, right? Men work in certain positions and women work in other positions. Anybody in between doesn't have a role. Right. In communities that were more communal, or in even like Native American communities.
Well, communities of tradition, extended family structure, et cetera.
Where you have to deal with people, where you just can't put them away.
Right. They're incorporated into your society in sacred ways, in necessary ways.
So a lot of times people took on roles that, people had roles, right? If you were somebody who, the term two-spirit refers to having, both like female and male, like identity within you. And so that must be special, right? If you can see both viewpoints, if you can identify with two groups, then you must have, a purpose in the society. And that's a difference between those cultures and our culture here, is that, that there were more places for people to be, right? In society. So
let's go to slide for a second, can you? The current slide. And you're going to have to blow that up, use your magic, so that we can just concentrate on the black and white part, if you could, and kind of bring that up in center. Okay, so just to describe what you're seeing, this is from Williams' book, The Spirit and the Flesh. And what this is a woodcut of Temecula natives. It's a Spanish woodcut. And what you're seeing is two-spirit men, actually a series of two-spirit men. This is a battle between two tribes in Florida. And the two spirits of both tribes, basically the battle stops while the two spirits of both tribes basically minister to the wounded and the dying and carry them off and basically minister to both sides. So they're non-combatants in this role, and there's a clear place for them, and it's a sacred place for them. And so, the Spanish are observing this, and this is who makes the woodcut, right? So, just as you say, there's this, two spirits, sacred role, necessary role, accepted role, and they're part of the economy, the ecology, etc. And you're going to have to do the same thing for this other one, this other slide here. Sorry to spring that on you, but here we go. So here's Balboa, the Spanish, basically taking those people, burning them alive, putting dogs on them. And so one of the things that, when we talk with Native scholars, and especially Native Two-Spirit scholars, that basically say, look, when you have a conception in which the two spirits, you can have like up to 7 genders of the Osage or whatever, and then you encounter a more, shall we say, our word for it would be homophobic culture in terms of the Spanish, basically suppressing that. Then what Native people learned to do was basically either suppress any mention of that sexuality or those different gender groups, or the sacred nature, in favor of the dominant norm, in which we have, as we were talking about, before, the myth of homophobia within communities of color, which among some communities of color is not so much a myth, but it is definitely nuanced. Let's talk about that for a second.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, in that, referring to those 2 slides before, so we can wrap that up. Yeah. I mean, there's also there's an interesting article that's written by Jeffrey Kimball. Okay. And he discusses. He basically does the etymology of some Aztec words. I don't remember because I read about this a long time ago. But like we were discussing earlier too, that there's only a couple of the actual Aztec books that are left. Yeah. Or pre-Columbian, like
the codices.
The codices left in the world, right? Yeah. And only 2 of them are actually written or drawn by Native peoples, and the other ones were like commissioned by the missionaries. Yes. And in some of the references,
somewhat suspect.
Right. Well, it was suspect because they actually imposed some of the some of their beliefs into what was recorded for
Right.
how the Aztecs treated homosexuals.
The winners writing the history,
Right.
as it were. Yeah.
Right. And the same similar situation where they were integrated into society, maybe not in the in this utopian way, but people were integrated into society, and they definitely didn't have the same attitude.
Yeah.
But and I guess coming back and talking about how communities of color are more homophobic, it's interesting because I think in LA, since there was such a huge group of Latinos, I didn't experience as much of that.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends, even when I was in high school, like for example, in my high school, one of the couple that won the cutest couple was a lesbian couple in 1997. But and that was an all Latino high school. It was 99% Latinos who went to that high school. And
What high school?
Bell High School.
Okay. Yeah.
And everybody, and people voted for them. And the parents might have different, reactions, but the students and
Both
other people,
femme butch. What?
yeah, they were, I don't know, they were pretty androgynous in that
Yeah.
way.
Okay.
But they, I didn't have as much, when people are coming, oh, the Latino community is so homophobic. I think that there's aspects of that, but when you're in a community where where there's a sub community, for example, like here, moving here and seeing how small the Latino community is here, and in general only seeing a certain aspect of it and not actually having a large population of queer Latinos out,
Yeah.
You really can't influence that community as much,
Yeah.
because the threat of being exiled from a smaller community
Right.
into
Right.
into what you don't have anyone. So I can see why there would be more of a closeted nature for people where you're holding on to your racial identity.
Yeah.
And
It's
I think
safer.
It's safer, and
Yeah.
I think that there's just as if we want to put it in that context, I think that there's more homophobic white people in Oregon than there are Latinos, just because of sheer numbers.
Right.
But people never think about it that way.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
I mean, it's almost like it's subsumed,
Yes.
essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think when there is a large population, when there is a large support group, you can't just ignore that, and you have to deal with it. There's a lot of resources in LA specifically for queer Latinos, organizations that just are about that, and I don't see any support specifically even for queer community as much as for queer community in general here.
Yeah.
So I can see why there isn't why there those things can come up, but it's more complicated than people make it out to be.
Because, I remember, especially doing, AIDS work or AIDS-related work, because, my work in the addictions field, that's, we're forced to deal with that, right? And looking at, the phenomenon basically in LA, among other places, in terms of AIDS service organizations dominated by white gay males who often categorically refuse to do outreach to communities of color or have bilingual services or even have the odd flyer about SIDA or, basic stuff. So, when we look at, organizing in gay Chicano communities in Los Angeles, you see the same parallel organization in terms of, topical, like dealing with AIDS stuff or things that are specific to the community. Do you see that kind of organization as a model?
What's interesting, though, is that nonprofits in general are still pretty backwards.
Yeah.
And you would be surprised at how the lack of support that there is for even in a community that is so large.
Yeah.
There's definitely more Spanish-speaking people working in, prevention stuff.
Yeah.
But there's not nearly enough of what you need.
Right.
And in Oregon, or in, the service areas that I've seen here, it's very difficult to justify, hiring somebody to do specific outreach. And if you hire somebody to do specific outreach, then all of a sudden they're in charge of the entire community.
Right.
Whereas you have 5 staff people who are white who are in charge of the white community, but you have like one person who's in charge of the entire, Latino community.
Instead of that cultural competency being spread throughout the organization, as would be the ideal.
Right. And so in LA, it's similar. I think, you just have to if you're gonna work in. It depends on where you're working at or where you're working at. If you're obviously in East LA, then you're gonna have more more people of color working in those communities.
Yeah.
But it's surprising to see how the lack of support there is for that.
Yeah. So, in terms of, if you can talk a little bit more about the cultural tradition within your identified group towards, people like you, whatever that is.
Yeah. Well, I wrote something down, but let me see. What did I write down? I think, when we were talking about that myth, but there is, a real way that, I guess Latinos interact with it. But I think it also has to do with how religious people are.
Yes.
If you come from a religious background, then you kind of default to whatever that religion says. And that's kind of the first defense that people have. They're like, well, the Bible says this, or, the church says this. So, and not to say that people who are not religious are less homophobic, because there's also things that you deal with that, but you don't have that aspect of it. And oftentimes it's hard to argue with like the word of God, versus like your own opinion. So in that sense, you do have your standard kind of religious answer, and then you do have another more a conversation about gender roles and like masculinity and like machismo and that kind of stuff, and for women like femininity and what that means. But I think what's interesting about Latino culture that I notice is that it's more interested in your gender role than it is in your sexuality. Yeah. Because all of a sudden it means that you're not male, or if you're not female, if you're if you're LGBT, if you're queer. And not so much what it is, but more.
Well, is there, for example, so if we're talking about language, right? So it's what the church says, what the Bible says. You were making reference to, okay, you're Huichole, not Aztec. Just like, here in the States, where the dominant cultural group, that gets imposed on all Indians is like, what I refer to half jokingly is, okay, the fundamentalist Indians, Lakotas, or Navajos, right? And so everybody knows, you got the white hippies doing blessing ways, right, for, baby showers, right? You've got people saying, all my relations, Matakwiyasi, but wait a minute, what about the indigenous Oregon tribes, if we even know who they are, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess the point being, you get imposed, you get the Aztec codices, the two that survive, and then the rest that get rewritten as the dominant conversation, not, whatever indigenous nation you were, plus, the Catholic thing. So, when I was, growing up in Los Angeles, the only terms used for gay people were derogatory, Cholo Spanish, right? So is there an empowered, Spanish word, that is not derogatory?
No.
Right?
I think what's interesting is that...
so you borrow the English one, queer, which, still has...
Gay, I mean, I think what's interesting is that there is a large LGBT movement in the United States that has kind of crossed borders. Yeah. And it's gone transnational. Right. And that, gay is the word that a lot of people use all over the world. Right. And in Mexico, or, like even like, people would use gay, or in Spanish people would use gay. But I think, people are trying to, take back some words, right? Even Chicano was a derogatory term. But, like people would take back Joto, or they use or refer to, queer culture as joteria, and
joteria.
And so that's picking up amongst the people themselves, and it hasn't gone like mainstream or whatever. People wouldn't say it on the nightly news, or whatever. But it's people trying to take back their language and make sure that they're represented in that way, because even though people do kind of take on or kind of look at this country in terms of how the gay rights movement or the LGBT movement or the queer movement works here, they're all that lack of representation of people of color within it. Also goes also crosses those boundaries, people don't notice it. So there is a need for different languages, and I'm pretty sure that in different places people will use the way that their own cultures refer to themselves. But it also gets kind of swallowed in by the larger queer movement.
Yeah. And just as a a heterosexual observer, so why don't we get to invent our own terms? I mean, like this, when you use Hota and Hotaia, I mean, that's almost like a hip-hop sensibility of taking back nigga or something like that. And just, you could make an acronym of it and positivize it, but, reify or create a new word or a new terminology and as part of your liberation movement, whatever that is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why representation is so important, right? That's why people fight for TV spots. That's why people make a big deal about the gay character on a TV show, or like the gay mayor of Portland, or,
or the gay-friendly mayor of Portland.
Yeah, well, now he's gay and he's mayor of Portland, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But that's why, it's a big deal when you have someone from a community representing, the entire whole, because all of a sudden those issues get brought up to the limelight.
Yeah.
And I think, why that's why people fight for it so much,
right.
Because then you can, you have access to creating the language and how you refer to, and the framework for which people are going to refer to you, and that's the big deal about that,
Yeah. So in terms of, when one talks about the hierarchy of oppressions and your response to them, if you buy into a hierarchy of oppressions, or, within identity politics, there's favored issues like gay marriage, or, domestic partnerships, or et cetera, et cetera. Not that you're on the spot for speaking for your people,
right?
But I had noticed, for example, in a couple of issues of Just Out, especially in February, Black History Month, where they identify and interview black gays and lesbians, and they say, well, okay, gay marriage is like it's a white issue because we're dealing with survival issues before we can even get to marriage. Is there a similar outlook within the Chicano gay community?
Yeah, I think.
So what would be the issues then?
Well, it would be the same issues. It would be like survival issues.
Yeah.
I think communities of color in general are more like focused on like housing and affordableness of things.
Right.
Cost of things, and marriage. It is an important issue. I don't want to downplay that.
Right.
But
you got to be able to afford a house to have a marriage in, right?
You would want to actually benefit from what marriage gives you.
Right.
You would need assets.
Right.
And when we're talking about communities that have been underrepresented and and are not in those economic brackets, and marriage doesn't seem as big of a deal.
Yeah.
You kind of want to make sure that you have the resources that your community needs before that. So I think it breaks down that way also. But I think people see, in terms of the argument around marriage, it's more about not the issue of marriage itself, but about the queer movement's reluctance to take on the other issues.
Yes, right.
So it's not whether or not we should have marriage. I think we should definitely have it, right? I don't think you should deny, rights to a specific group in general,
right.
Especially their tax-paying citizens or whatever.
Especially.
But I think the beef comes when people are not taking into account that there are other issues that are more pertinent to other communities,
right?
Or even when you're trying to talk about marriage and not really trying to make it into an issue for other communities. If you don't have talking points about how marriage would affect communities of color or how this would actually change their lives,
right.
then they're not going to care. And
right.
then why you shouldn't be complaining that people are unhappy with it. But I think that's where it is, where it's an important issue, but it's not the only issue. And, that reluctance of not trying to figure out what are the other things is where, that comes from.
So what would be those talking points, you think?
In terms of how marriage affects
not just marriage.
like,
In terms of, it's kind of like, if I were going to be flip, you got to give the people their pozole, bean and rice, and so you can have your tofu cheesecake or whatever it is.
So what would they do? Okay.
Yeah.
They being the white queer community. Well, in just as simple things as like translating things,
Right.
Or doing outreach in specific communities. Those things don't get done nearly as much as they should be. Outreaching to different communities is not something
Bilingual, bicultural services,
Right.
being fluid, because, I observed your interaction with a student in multicultural. So it's like, oh, okay, right. Not obviously, college educated, very comfortable in identity, et cetera, picture, postcard, student organizer, role model, credit to his race, blah, 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 right? But to have those kind of services where, as professionals of color, it's like we're expected to be culturally competent with white people
Right.
automatically,
Right.
but there's no reciprocity there.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing is that when you get, I mean, you know this, right? When you get hired into a position and you're, one of, 5 people of color or something, then all of a sudden
right.
you have a whole other workload. And
Yeah.
you have, I think there's one person that speaks Spanish in enrollment services in this college. And when they cut down the hours that they're there. So sometimes I see people coming up the stairs and wandering around.
Looking for the brown
someone,
people
right.
that speak,
Yeah,
Spanish,
and then, so
right.
I've done it before.
Yeah.
I've done some academic counseling before,
Yeah,
some enrollment
okay.
counseling, with people because there are not enough signs that are translated for them. Like if
Yeah.
it says won't be back, till this day, that's not even there.
Yeah.
And then similar situation with organizations or with like larger movements, those little things don't get done,
Right.
and those little things mean a lot.
Yeah.
And when you're
Very
talking-
simple access.
And
yeah.
you're talking to communities that just want that access right now.
Yeah.
It seems like when you ask for something, people point to what they've already done, and that's fine. But it's also taking organizations kind of looking back and seeing what they're lacking, and being upfront about that is good too. So. But in the queer movement, those little things are not done, and there's also kind of a little bit of resistance to take them on because of those myths, right? So, for example, queer communities oftentimes are like, well, why do we have to outreach to them if they're not supportive of our community? Forgetting that there's a whole bridge there,
Yeah.
of like queer people of color.
Yeah. Right.
And that the invaluable asset there would be to gain access to those communities that can be potentially turned to vote, for your issues.
Right.
But instead, it's more of like you end up with more of an ignorant kind of like, well, they're homophobic, so they don't support us, so why should we support them?
Right. And it's simple things like that, like access or showing up, and even if some may deride it as being token, just the fact that you made the effort. Why should we do this for them if they don't support us, or or even maybe it's just my paranoid mind, but people go to the illegal immigration thing simply because you're a brown person, not assuming that you're a citizen.
Right.
Right. And so, oh well. And then they start taking on like as if they're Minutemen,
Right.
and they're gay or lesbian, and it's like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, do you want alliances or not? Do you want us to help you or not? So.
Well, I mean, right now, I think what's interesting with Oregon's domestic partnership movement or queer movement in general is that it is actually moving into building a little bit more bridges than I've seen in other places.
Even in Cali.
Yeah, I think in California that you have the advantage of having like almost unlimited resources
Right.
because of how many people are there.
Yeah.
And you can subsection organizations, right? Like queer people of color have enough critical mass to create their own organizations
Yes.
to advocate for themselves.
Right.
In Oregon, it's a different situation. That mass doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so, communities have to lobby their own communities for resources. And I think there's actually a bridge amongst, like, for example, Basic Rights Oregon does our Immigrants the New Gay workshop that builds a connection between immigration law, like the laws that are trying to be passed, with the second class citizen status that LGBT communities have, and and they also have a dismantling racism workshop for their own base, for like their white members to talk about race, and so there's that work is coming out of that, because you have a community that doesn't have the resources to do it, but they're big enough to move the organization themselves.
Right.
In California, you have, like I said, they can build their own organizations, and you often have like clashes amongst that, so that kind of impedes some of the progress. Not to say that there isn't, that work being done, but.
Well, it's interesting when because you were on the phone to Bro. I overheard part of that conversation. So it's like, all right. So when they were sending me stuff, mostly it was around. Equal rights for domestic partnership marriage piece, but did not talk at all about their outreach or any services to people of color. And it's not like I'm hiding. So
right.
It's like, so why didn't they bring that up, or why don't they talk about that?
Well, what's
often,
interesting too is that even with those organizations, sometimes I feel it surprises me how new it is for organizations.
Yeah.
And simple things like, not just talking to, not sending out emails or having different, what you think is a supporter list or a general list, or people that you feel won't be interested in things, like, don't get sent out, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a lot of organizations, and in general, like, people, I mean, diversifying or doing racial justice work in general with any organization is so behind. Simple things like, like respect, or like not overburdening, your workers, and those kinds of things are still kind of behind in that sense. But especially when we're talking about like diversity, or doing it in a respectful way, or how are you gonna outreach to communities? It's still very new.
Right.
And I'm trying to figure out how to best do it too, in general, like even with the organizations that I work with, always say we have the Oregon Student of Color Coalition and we have OSERA, but there shouldn't really be a need for them, right? The organization should
just be doing that work.
Should just be doing that work.
Right.
But there's still some institutional things where you actually need that role to exist. You need something to point to for some reason.
Well, here, especially because, one has to understand that this state was created to suppress diversity. From its very inception. The very idea of it was basically, a whites-only, before a whites-only homeland was even thought about by the white supremacists, right? So with that kind of history, it's not just that the numbers are artificially low. They were legislated to be so, right. Which means that any organization to fight that has to actually not just add these kind of services as an afterthought, but add them strategically, intentionally, to basically move that dead hand of history back, so that you start doing that and not doing it as an afterthought because you want to be politically correct or whatever, because it's a necessity for increasing your base.
Yeah, you know what? Yes, and in general with. It's just that it's happening, right?
Yeah.
And I feel that that's what's interesting, is that people get surprised. Oh my God, we have all of this diversity.
Yeah.
What do we do? But not anticipating that it'll happen and that it's going to get bigger.
Right.
That this, there's just no way that this state could stay, so homogenous.
Right. It can't.
The economy here is, not that strong.
Right.
There's going to be a need for, for different kinds of workers. There's different kinds of people to come in. And so the state's going to, diversify on its own.
Yes.
The problem is people's resistance to trying to figure out a good model for including people in a way that is, just and, fair. Same thing. That's good for people.
But they're expressed differently. Because,
right.
I mean, there's the whole piece, about trying to explain, that diversity is happening. It's not a threat, okay? you're including people who have your so-called family values to a greater degree than you or your kids are displaying, respect for authority, respect for education, hardworking, and already used to basically dealing with hardship and deprivation, so that when they get even a few more advantages, they can take off with them, right? In a good way, right? And so that's the kind of folks you want to have when everybody's experiencing hard times. People who are used to hard times and thriving in them, so you can learn from them.
Yeah, and I think just the threat in general is really scary for people, and I think that also when you talk about diversity or, communities diversifying, you have a slew of, legislation that gets, thrown out. All of the immigration laws that are passing don't do anything real to curb immigration.
No, of course not.
Even if you put up a wall, like that still wouldn't necessarily work. And, sending people back would cost more money than it'd actually, make. So nothing it really, they're all very reactionary, very, kind of evil-spirited, like, laws. But even just in terms of immigration, but with other communities too, it's just going to happen. And I think that, not having a discussion or not having those forums for those discussions to happen just makes it harder for people to take in, and just making sure that we can, talk to people and convince them that, it's going to happen, and, it'll be better if people, are able to kind of have those conversations, or are willing to, or, learning about other communities. And on that thing, there needs to be better laws around, racial justice. Our answer in Oregon to, the black population shouldn't be creating more prisons, and, expanding mandatory minimums, for Latino communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That shouldn't be the answer. But unfortunately, it is in Oregon.
Yes. Yeah, out of fear, etc. So, when you have if in order to have smarter organizations, you need smarter people within them, as part of them. So, how would you, or how have you forged a successful and healthy identity as an individual yourself? What's been your journey?
Well, I've been out for a long time.
Okay.
It seems I came out when I was 18.
Okay.
Which, a lot of people are coming out younger now.
Right.
I see a lot of I met a lot of high school kids here, and it's interesting. I've worked with a lot of high school kids here who are queer, who came out in high school and then, dropped out of school, got their GED, and then came to Lane Community College.
Yes. Very common pattern.
Yeah,
really.
And it tells you a little bit about the hostile environment in high schools.
Still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but, I've met a lot of people who are coming out, and it's interesting that they found a way to continue their education.
Yeah.
For me, I came out and I was always pretty aware of my surroundings, and I didn't have a traumatic coming out story or anything like that.
Okay.
But I did, go away from where from LA. When I went to school at UC Santa Barbara, it was far enough where I could be a different person, and do things at my own pace and figure things out. But luckily, I found a community that was really supportive.
Okay.
And
in IV or something like that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, in Santa Barbara and Ivy.
Yeah.
And
Isla Vista for you non-California.
Pretty much.
Radical hotbed from way back. Yeah.
They burned down their Bank of
Burned
America.
down their Bank of America, famously. Yeah.
And so I came out in a pretty, supportive environment that wasn't just, supportive of me being gay, but also supportive of, that would check me. I created another family. And if I was doing something that was unhealthy, they would let me know.
Good.
And have conversations with me and ask me where I was, what I was doing and those kinds of things. And then, on top of that, my family's been pretty supportive. And I've also been able to identify negative influences around me and not, have them around me. So I think that's what I attribute why I'm not crazy. Because I think
because you know some people who are.
Yeah.
And so I guess part of that the piece in asking you that question and to make those things visible is that, all right, if you can detect negative influences around you, then that's one piece that you can impart to others. But then to be able, either through your college education or your political education or spiritual education, whichever it is, that allows you then to identify the forces that create those negative forces, and then by opposing end them, as Billy Shakes would say. You know, I mean, that's a critical piece to be able to do that, to impart to the next generation, to be able to, you know, combat that and change things.
But yeah, and I think that, you know, the only way to do that is to, in terms of if we're having another curriculum and or something.
Yeah, because we're going to go there too.
Yeah, those things like have made me pretty healthy, you know. But it is having people or having a support network there. Yeah. And like, if there wasn't, you know, services for people, then those people who I came out to or with wouldn't have been there. You know, there wasn't a community around that where they can congregate or whatever. So I think, you know, those things are important, that there has to be an established support group for people. If whether it's organized or not, you know, there has to be some, you know, people can't continue to kind of try to stamp them out. Or trying to make it into a negative environment, because you're just going to have a lot of, I mean, it just adds to, you know, risky behaviors from people, you know, if people are trying to figure something out, you know. So, I mean, yeah.
Who would be your role models?
My role models?
Well, I mean, you won. Maybe you don't seek cop to that, but you won. So, you know, where, you know, in terms of your strengths and your struggles, like, you know, who inspired you or who taught you and who influenced and molded you?
As much as I hate to admit it, my parents, or my mom especially, is a very big influence in how I am. And I think I don't know if so much as she's a role model, as much as she just kind of molded me into her. Okay. Or dealing with herself that way. Yeah. So she's pretty you would never call my mom a hypocrite. She's just kind of very straightforward about everything, sometimes too much and painfully so. Moms,
I think they like that.
Yeah, and she had a really great talent she does have a really great talent for identifying or seeing where people are at or coming from. And it's very intuitive. Something I get very surprised at how sharp she is about picking people out. I mean, like, this person's dealing with this, or this is the way that they are. This is why they are that way. And I think, you know, that ability for me has, you know, kind of, and her doing it to me consistently has always made me very self-aware in terms, or not aware, but I've always been questioning myself, you know, like, where am I coming from with this? Why am I acting this way? What am I doing with this? What do I really need from this?
Well, the skill of self-reflection is actually a pretty good thing to have.
Yeah.
So can you do it for others?
What do you mean, like, be like where? Well, I mean, I think I have to. That's why I'm an organizer.
Yeah.
I think I have to. I mean, my job is
to point that out to you.
Is to identify.
Notice
people.
That as a strength, you know, for what you do, you know, and.
So I have to figure out where people are at and see what they're willing to do and how they want to do it, and figure out what the best way for them to get involved is. And, you know, when we're talking about politics, when people get involved politically or with an organization, it's a very, I mean, I don't know how people see it, but it's a very life-changing thing for people, because all of a sudden you're questioning authority,
right?
And you're not just going on a
especially when authority is questionable, you should definitely question it.
And then people get involved with learning how power works or how laws are made, and then all of a sudden you start kind of internalizing that and figuring out how, you know, you operate because of how a law or something had told you to do. Yeah. And then you're like, why do I have to do that? And all of a sudden you're self-aware. Yeah. And so it's becoming politically conscious, or, you know, getting involved politically has that effect on people, where all of a sudden you figure out that you've been kind of led into a certain path all of your life, and then all of a sudden you can kind of put an end to it, and figure out, and you have power around your environment, and you can kind of carry your own space with you, and those kinds of things. So figuring where people are at in that point is something that I have to do. You know?
Yeah. I mean, again, you know, I was in a elementary school class yesterday. And one of the kids, you know, it's one of those out of the mouth of babe things, who talked about, you know, why people make certain laws out of fear, you know, like, why did Samuel Thurston do what he did, to prevent free black Americans from coming to Oregon, to become citizens, because they would cause the Indians to, have uprisings and kill the whites, which, okay, that's not going to happen. So what are you afraid of? And, the immigration laws speak to the same thing as you referenced. So, why fear the queer? Why fear the brown? Why fear these folks and then create these laws to, to put them in their place? And that's what politics and power is about. And so to combat them, you have to become self-aware and then teach others to become self-aware through their fear, in spite of their fear.
Well, I mean, this election, that just happened, it was really interesting to see how much people didn't know. And how much I didn't know. When it came down to looking at my ballot, I was like, whoa, I don't understand any of this.
Yeah.
I have to read it and read a couple of opinions. I'm like, I have to do a lot of work to figure out if I should say yes or no. And that, but what's really easy and really easy to manipulate is people's fear.
Yes.
If you say, we're going to, vote for me because I'm going to make sure that, I stop illegal immigration and make sure that you keep your jobs, people will understand that. But if you try to talk about a more complicated, a more complicated solution to the immigration problem, people won't understand it. And so it's a lot easier to sell fear and hate than it is to actually have people question and think about what they're doing.
Yeah.
And our society is not set up for that.
Right. I mean, and it's, and the illegal immigration question still is about the Mexicans instead of the 500,000 white people who are actually doing jobs that you would do, that are paying 50, 60, 70 grand, and they're here illegally.
Right.
And the conversation is never about them, right? And they're actually more of a threat, but you don't necessarily deal with them.
It's racialized with what people can understand, right? Because then they start talking about, European immigrants, then they're saying, oh, wait, I'm a European immigrant. That complicates things, you know?
Right.
But it's much easier to other somebody else, obviously,
So in the last 5 minutes, or actually less than 5 minutes than we have, if you were to create a healthy curriculum for those that come after you, what would it look like or contain, and what would you want people to know?
Well, a curriculum. Well, here goes. No.
And you got 3 minutes.
Okay. Well, no, I think that there obviously needs to be more representation. That people need to be, like, I think, a course in sexuality, or, more courses around, the nuances of it, because it's actually a lot more complicated than people make it out to be.
Than the plumbing lecture that they do.
Right. Yeah. And I think if people have, that conversation, more often, I think that's what needs to happen. Too often people go to a workshop or read a book or see something on TV and they're like, I understand. And it's like, no, you don't.
No, you don't.
And the only way to understand other people is to actually be around other people and to know their and respect, where they're coming from, is to pretty much learn more, right? So read more books, an opportunity to force people to do that. And especially we're talking about courses or a curriculum for the college, it would be, you would have to have, a class or more forums about it. You would have to do it a more of a concerted effort, have more representation around it. I don't even know who the out queer people are all on campus. I've met them here and there, but there's never been a kind of a meet and greet or anything like that. So it's really interesting, around where you kind of pick people out. And so making sure that there's places where people can, meet each other and, and that's not just for LGBT people, but for everybody, so that they could get to know each other and ask each other questions, instead of kind of, keeping it in certain areas or not talking about it at all. And I think in general, you need to, when we're working with younger people in general, it's really important because they not only do they not know about sexuality, I mean they do, but don't have an understanding of it that a lot of people have. They also don't have an understanding of how to deal with their emotions in the same way as adults do who've had more experience. So people just end up mirroring or having to deal with that in a different way. And if there isn't a good example, then who knows what happens. You're kind of rolling the dice there. So there needs to be
rolling the dice of following what you saw on TV or whatever, which if you're not going to get it from your parents, if you're not going to get it from your church, what does that leave us?
Right.
Your peers, cable, real sex on HBO. I mean, the Playboy Channel. What?
And that's why you end up having a very consumerist-minded, like, LGBT community that
Good point.
ends up being
Consumerist-minded, yeah.
a very, superficial, like, stereotype about, gays who decorate your home and decorate your bodies or whatever.
Yeah.
Because, they get most of their education around sexuality through the TV. And what does the TV sell you? Ads.
Ads, right.
So, what is a healthy, way to experiment with your sexuality?
So, final thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show.
Hey, this is great.
Never done it before. But yeah, I think
camera likes you.
I've been trying to avoid looking at myself. But no, thank you so much for having me. I think, it is really important to have, representation. That's why I was like, well, I think it'll be good to come on the show. Talk about that, but you kind of got a bunch of stuff for me,
I'll say.
In terms of my intersecting identities.
And you weren't even shy about it. That's good. That's good.
But yeah, thank you.
So if you've liked what you've seen, and give us feedback, so you can email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu, and tell us what you liked about this or any other show that you'll see. That will be streamed on the web sooner or later. We welcome your feedback. This has been DiversiTV. Our guest has been Alejandro Jaurez of OSAC and Oregon Student Association, and I'm Mark Harris. We will see you in the future. Go well, stay well.